Before I get into this story, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know. And I'll tell you this much right now. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Just wait. Let people walk straight into the wall they built themselves. My name is Nadia. I'm 32 years old. I'm a licensed occupational therapist, and I own a 2-bedroom house in Raleigh, North Carolina. I want you to hold on to that word, own. Not rent, not borrow, not share. Own. I bought it myself with 8 years of saving, skipping vacations, driving a car with a cracked dashboard, and eating lunch at my desk every single day. The closing papers have my name on them. Just mine. The house is a 1940s craftsman bungalow with original hardwood floors and a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. I painted the front door a deep slate blue the weekend I moved in. My neighbor across the street, an older woman named Gloria, came over with a plate of lemon bars and said, "That color is dignified." I thought about that word for days. Dignified. That's what I wanted my home to be. That's what I'd worked for. I live alone and I love it. I have a 3-year-old golden retriever named Biscuit, who sleeps at the foot of my bed and greets me at the door every evening like I've just returned from war. I have a reading chair by the window in the 2nd bedroom that I turned into a little office. I have a kitchen where I know where everything is, a bathroom where nothing gets moved, and a Saturday morning routine that involves coffee, the crossword, and complete silence. It took me a long time to build this life. It took me longer to believe I deserved it. I grew up the older of 2 kids. My brother Danny is 3 years younger than me, and from the time he was small, he was the one my parents worried about in a way that felt more like devotion. Danny was charming and funny and never quite landed. He'd start things and not finish them. College twice, a business idea once, a relationship that my parents told him was the other person's fault when it ended. He's not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. Danny is actually someone I genuinely like when our parents aren't in the room. But our parents spent so many years cushioning every fall for him that he never quite learned to brace himself. My parents are good people too. I believe that, but they have this particular way of making decisions that only works if everyone agrees without being asked. My mother will announce something at the dinner table as though it's already done, in a tone so warm and reasonable that disagreeing feels like kicking a dog. My father backs her up with silence, which in our family functions the same as applause. I spent my whole childhood learning to read that room. I got very good at it. The problem is, getting good at reading a room and getting good at leaving a room are 2 completely different skills, and I didn't learn the second one until much later. Danny got divorced 14 months ago. His wife, Cara, left after 3 years of marriage, and from what I could piece together from the half-stories my mother told me, Cara had been unhappy for a long time, and Danny had been surprised by this, which itself told me something. He moved into an apartment in Durham, and for a while things seemed okay. He got a new job doing sales for a logistics company. He started going to the gym. My mother called me every week with updates like she was reporting on a patient in recovery. My birthday is in March. I turned 32 this past year, and I decided to keep it small. Dinner at my parents' house, just the 4 of us. I brought a bottle of wine and wore the blue dress I bought on sale in January. My mother made lasagna because it's my favorite, and for the first hour it was exactly what I wanted. Easy, warm, normal. Then the lasagna was cleared and my mother brought out the cake, and after the candles, she sat back down, folded her hands on the table, and smiled at me in the way that means she's about to say something she has already decided. She said Danny's apartment lease was up in 2 months. She said the new place he'd been looking at fell through. She said it would only be temporary, just a few months at most, just while he got back on his feet, and she and my father had been thinking. And her voice stayed so soft, so reasonable, that since I had that 2nd bedroom just sitting there, it made the most sense for Danny to stay with me for a while, just until summer. Maybe through August at the latest. She said it the way you'd say pass the salt. Like the answer was already yes, and we were just getting through the formality of saying it out loud. I looked at my brother. He was studying the tablecloth. I looked at my father. He was nodding faintly the way he does, like a man who has already voted and is just waiting for the count. I picked up my fork and took a bite of cake. Vanilla with lemon buttercream. My mother makes it every year. I said, and I smiled, and I said it was delicious. And then I steered the conversation toward my father's retirement plans, and we talked about that for 40 minutes, and when I left that night, I hugged them both and drove home with the windows down, even though it was only 50 degrees outside. I needed the cold air. I needed something that felt honest. Here is what I did not say at that table, and what I want to say now, clearly, so you understand the full picture. I have one spare bedroom. It has a queen bed, a closet, and a window that faces the backyard. It also shares a wall with my bedroom. My house has 1.5 bathrooms. My kitchen is not large. My front porch is peaceful specifically because only I decide who stands on it. My brother is 39 years old. He is not a teenager. He is not ill. He is going through a hard time, which is a real thing, and I'm not dismissing it. But hard times at 39 do not automatically mean your older sister's house becomes a halfway house. And my parents have a 4-bedroom colonial and carry with a finished basement and 2 full bathrooms and Danny's old room, which my mother has kept as a guest room with the same navy comforter he had in high school. But that was not the offer on the table. I drove home that night and sat on my porch with Biscuit and thought about what I was actually dealing with. I'd seen this pattern before. Not the first time my parents had made a decision about my life in a room I was sitting in. When I was 24, they volunteered me to drive my grandmother to her appointments every week without asking, and I did it for 18 months before I finally said I couldn't anymore, and my mother cried and my father went quiet and I felt like I'd burned something down. When I was 27, they told me at Easter that I should look into buying a house in their neighborhood, and when I bought in Raleigh instead, they didn't speak about it for 3 months like I'd personally offended the zip code. The pattern is this. They decide. They announce. They wait for me to absorb it and comply. And if I don't comply, there is no explosion. There is something worse. A soft, sustained grief that fills the air and makes me feel like I have done something cruel by existing as a person with preferences. I was done being done in by softness. I called my friend Priya the next morning. Priya has been my closest friend since graduate school, and she has a very particular gift for cutting through things. I told her the whole story over the phone while I was walking Biscuit around the block. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Are you going to let him move in?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. So what's the plan?" I told her I wasn't going to have a confrontation. I'd learned a long time ago that confrontation with my family was like arguing with fog. You never win because the fog never actually engages, it just sort of drifts and reconstitutes itself around you. What I was going to do instead was remove myself from the equation entirely. Quietly. Completely. I was going to change the locks and I was not going to tell anyone. Priya was quiet again. Then she said, "Can I be there when it happens?" I said, "I'll call you." Let me explain what I mean by remove myself. My parents had made an announcement, not a request. That meant they were not waiting for my verbal agreement. They were waiting for my passive compliance. For me to not object loudly enough, not draw a hard enough line, and then one day Danny would show up with a bag and I would be standing in my own doorway not quite knowing how to say no in real time. That's how it had always worked. I'd never learned to object in advance, only to absorb and resent in retrospect. This time, I decided to object in a language they couldn't argue with, not words, facts. The week after my birthday, I called a locksmith. I had the front door rekeyed, the back door rekeyed, and the side gate latch replaced with a combination lock. I did not call my parents to tell them. I did not call Danny. I went about my weeks normally. I texted my mother about her garden. I called my father on a Sunday like I always do. I had Danny over for dinner one Thursday and we watched a documentary about Formula One racing and I made turkey chili, and we talked about his job and whether he was dating anyone and he seemed okay. Genuinely okay, and I thought to myself that if he'd actually asked me, if he called me himself and said, "Nadia, I'm in a tough spot, is there any chance?" that conversation would have gone differently. It wasn't about Danny. It was about what my parents had decided over my head at a birthday dinner. About 3 weeks after the dinner, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening. She asked how I was. I said good. She asked about work. I said busy. Then she said, in that warm, reasonable voice, that she and my father had been talking and they thought it might be a good idea for Danny to go ahead and bring a few things over to my place that weekend, just so he had a sense of where he'd be setting up. And she'd already mentioned it to him and he was thinking Saturday. I said, okay, just that. Okay. She sounded pleased. She said she'd have Danny call me to coordinate. He never called. Which told me this: the plan was not for Danny to coordinate with me. The plan was for Danny to show up, and for me to be there, and for the presence of his boxes in my hallway to be the fait accompli. That is how these things worked in my family. Not cruelty, logistics. You create the physical reality and then the emotional reality has to arrange itself around it. I had somewhere to be that Saturday. I'd already planned it. Lunch with Priya, then an afternoon at the botanical gardens, then dinner at a Thai place we both loved. Biscuit was going to my neighbor Gloria's, where he spent the occasional weekend when I traveled for work. Gloria loves Biscuit almost as much as I do, and had been asking to have him anyway. But I had also asked Priya to come to my house first. Here's the thing about Priya: she is absolutely unintimidating on the surface. She's 5'3", she has a warm smile, and she teaches pediatric physical therapy, so her whole professional manner is calm and pleasant and patient. She is also one of the most grounded people I have ever met, and she has no personal history with my family, which means she has no reflexive deference toward them. She was not going to shrink. I gave Priya my new key that Saturday morning. Biscuit had already gone to Gloria's. I left around 10 o'clock, headed toward downtown, and I told Priya she could arrive any time after 11 and just let herself in. Make herself coffee, use the Wi-Fi, read her book. She had nowhere to be until noon. She was just house-sitting, technically. I have a friend who sometimes checks on my place when I'm out. That's not unusual. That's just a person with a key to their friend's house. Danny showed up at 11:47. I know this because Priya texted me. She said, "Your brother is here with 2 bags and a lamp." I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I answered the door and introduced myself and said I was just hanging out while you were out, and I didn't have any information about when you'd be back." He looked confused. He asked if he could wait inside. I said I wasn't really comfortable with that since I didn't know him. He's still on the porch. I put my phone face down on the restaurant table and finished my water. She texted again. He called someone. Possibly your mom? He's been on the phone for about 5 minutes. He looks stressed. He keeps looking at the door. And then, he just left. Bags and lamp back in his car. He drove away. I looked up at Priya across the table from me. Not the Priya on my phone, but the one who'd come to meet me for lunch, and she raised her eyebrows. "He left," I said. She raised her water glass. "To dignified homes," she said. My mother called me at 12:15. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 12:40. I let that go too. My father called once, which was notable because he almost never calls me directly. That alone told me the temperature had changed. I listened to the voicemails that evening on my porch, Biscuit back from Gloria's and stretched out across my feet. My mother's first message was composed. She said Danny had gone by my house, and there was a girl there she didn't know and she just wanted to understand what was happening. Her second message was less composed. She said she thought we'd all agreed and she wasn't sure why I hadn't said something sooner if there was a problem, and she was hurt that I'd let her find out this way. My father's message was 4 words. "Call me, please, Nadia." I called my father back first because of the please. He picked up on the second ring. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. He said he was confused. I still remember the casual shrug. As she handed me 200 Levin and his children and 200 and love, I fancied I should have said that clearly at the birthday dinner. And I was sorry I hadn't, but the answer was no. I said it in one sentence. No qualifications. No, because of this, or I'd just feel like, or maybe when. No. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother is upset." I said, "I know. I'd be happy to talk to her when she's ready to have a conversation." He said okay. He said he'd pass that on. We said goodbye. My mother did not call back that night. She called the next morning, and when she did, her voice had shifted into something quieter, more careful. She asked if I'd thought about how hard things had been for Danny. I said yes, I had, and I cared about my brother, and I was happy to support him in ways that worked for both of us. But having him live in my home was not something I was able to do. She said it would have only been a few months. I said I understood that was the plan, but it wasn't something I'd agreed to. She said she thought I had agreed. I said I had not. I had said okay to one phone call, and I should have been clearer, and that was on me, but my silence had never been consent. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why didn't you just say something at dinner?" And I said, "Because I've spent a long time not knowing how. I'm learning." She didn't have an answer for that. We stayed on the phone a little longer, talking around the edges of things, and then said goodbye in a way that felt unresolved but not broken. I've learned those are different. Unresolved means there's still room. Broken is something else. What happened after is slower and less dramatic, which I think is actually the more honest version of how things change in families. My parents did not suddenly transform. My mother needed several weeks before she called me with the same ease she had before. My father sent me an article about craftsman bungalow renovations 2 weeks later without any comment attached, which in our family's language is the equivalent of a peace offering. I took it as one. Danny found a place. A one-bedroom apartment in Chapel Hill, about 20 minutes from my house. He moved in at the end of April. A few weeks later, he texted me a photo of his living room, new couch, his books on the shelf, a plant he'd bought himself in the window. He wrote, "First place that's actually mine in a long time. Feels weird." Good weird. I wrote back, "That's the right kind of weird. I meant it." I genuinely wanted that for him. I think that when we stop letting other people make our arrangements for us, even the arrangements that are supposed to be comfortable, we find out what we're actually capable of. Danny had to be pushed out of the easy option to find the real one. I had to stop softening my no until it dissolved. Priya and I still laugh about the lamp. The image of my brother standing on my front porch with 2 bags and a floor lamp, ringing the doorbell of the house he believed was already his for the taking, and a stranger answering in a cardigan with a cup of coffee. That image has become a kind of shorthand between us. Whenever one of us is dealing with something that requires us to hold a line, one of us will text the other just, "Lamp." The front porch still has 2 rocking chairs. I sit in one of them most evenings when the weather is right, with biscuit on the boards beside me and a cup of something warm. Gloria waves from across the street sometimes. The door behind me is slate blue. It's mine. I didn't stop loving my family to make it mine. I didn't blow anything up. I didn't win an argument or make anyone cry in a satisfying movie moment. I just changed the locks and let the situation explain itself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remove the door that was never supposed to be open in the first place. Let people discover the lock exists. Let that be the whole conversation. That's what I learned at 32. That no is not an argument. No is a door. And the door was always mine to close. If any part of the story felt familiar, drop it in the comments. Tell me where you're from. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me if you ever had someone make a decision about your life in a room you were sitting in. I read every single comment. And if this is your first time here, welcome to Solid Revenge. Subscribe because I have more stories, and not one of them ends with me saying yes when I meant no. I've thought a lot about why I didn't just say no at that dinner table. The cake was good. The room was warm. My mother's voice was so reasonable. And I think that's the honest answer. I had spent so many years confusing softness with love that I didn't know how to interrupt it without feeling like I was breaking something precious. But here's what I've come to understand. The thing I was so afraid of breaking was never actually love. It was a pattern. And patterns are not the same as people. What happened with my brother and that front porch didn't unfold the way it did, because I planned some elaborate revenge. It unfolded that way because I finally made a decision ahead of time instead of reacting in the moment. That's the quiet shift nobody talks about. Most of us are trained to respond, to wait until the problem is standing in our doorway before we figure out what we actually want. I just decided earlier than usual. That's all. A locksmith, a key, a friend with a cardigan, and a cup of coffee. The situation explained itself. There's something I believe very deeply, and it has nothing to do with luck or fate or anything outside of ourselves. It's this. The choices we make when no one is watching us, when there's no audience and no applause, are the ones that actually determine what our lives look like. I changed those locks on a Tuesday afternoon. Nobody saw it. Nobody called me brave. I just did it and went back to work. But that quiet Tuesday decision was what made the Saturday make sense. Integrity isn't loud. That's the thing people get wrong about it. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up. In the form of a door that doesn't open for people who assumed it always would. In the form of a phone call where you say one word clearly instead of 10 words softly. It accumulates in the small private moments when you choose what you actually value over what is simply easier. I also think a great deal about Danny in all of this. My brother is not a villain in this story, and I need that to be clear. He was a person who had been carried for so long that he'd stopped noticing the weight wasn't his own strength. The kindest thing that happened for him was that I wasn't home that Saturday. He had to find his own place. He had to figure out his own first of the month. And now he has a plant on a windowsill and a couch he picked out himself, and he texted me about it like a person who had just discovered something he didn't know he'd been missing. That's not a small thing. That's someone waking up to their own capability. And it never would have happened if I had said yes. The consequences in this story fell where they were supposed to fall, not cruelly, not dramatically, but correctly. My parents learned that my silence had never been agreement. My brother learned that he could stand on his own, and I learned that the word no does not require an explanation or an apology or a follow-up email. It just requires the courage to mean it before someone else is already standing in your hallway. That's the whole lesson, not loud, not complicated. Just decide what's yours and protect it quietly and let the situation do the rest of the talking.